Reopened but under strict Israeli conditions, Gaza's Rafah border crossing is once again operational as part of the US brokered ceasefire. But with Israel's restrictions, will this reopening ease the suffering of Palestinians after 2 years of war? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Maleen, Saeed. It's Gaza's only window to the outside world. The southern Rafah border crossing has finally reopened after months of closure as a result of Israel's devastating war on the Strip. Hopes were running high that the freedom of movement would ease the dire humanitarian crisis created by this war. But Israel has set strict conditions on who would leave the Strip and who would enter. Now, only a small number of people are allowed to move in both directions, and mainly for medical evacuations. But much needed humanitarian aid and construction material are still barred from entering the Strip, which is in ruins. We'll discuss why the Rafah crossing is central to Gaza and the millions of Palestinians with our guests in just a moment. First, this report from Imogen Kimber.
These ambulances were the first vehicles to enter Gaza through Rafah as part of a trial reopening. A fleet like this has been desperately needed in the Strip. But for nearly 2 years, the Rafah crossing, the main gateway to Gaza, has been closed by Israel. These people are some of the initial wave of foot traffic. Israel's total blockade on Gaza meant the population of 2.3 million were trapped under Israeli bombardment. Food was withheld or rationed, causing a famine that killed more than 450 people. And so was medicine and virtually everything else, leading to deaths and illness. Some say the reopening is hopeful.
The opening of the Rafah crossing might mean that people are able to reconnect with families that they've been separated from. We're hopeful that it might mean that Palestinians in Gaza who urgently need to be medically evacuated might be able to do so. And we're hopeful that it means that more humanitarian assistance might be able to enter Gaza, which is incredibly important, if not vital.
However, only a few hundred people a day are allowed by Israel to use the crossing.
We are not happy with the crossing being open in such a way. We want a large number of people to be able to leave, for it to be open so that ill people can come and go. I have a daughter in need of treatment. She's on the verge of death.
Reopening Rafah was part of the US brokered ceasefire agreement and 20-point peace plan. Allowing adequate levels of humanitarian aid back into Gaza was also part of phase 1 of the agreement. But there is no clear detail on when this will happen. According to US envoy Steve Witkoff, the plan has moved to phase 2. The Board of Peace and the Executive Council that will oversee the reconstruction of Gaza has been established. It's thought the reopening of the crossing will facilitate their work. Another part of phase 2 is the disarming of Hamas, but details are also lacking on how that will take place. Meanwhile, Israel is continuing to intensify its bombardment in Gaza, despite the ceasefire. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Before we talk to our guests, let's go first to our correspondent, Tariq Abu Azoum. He joins us from Khan Yunis in Gaza. Tariq, today is the official opening day of the Rafah crossing. We understand that 50 patients will be allowed to leave the Strip for urgent medical care abroad, along with some of their family members. Can you tell us as much as you can about the process and how many have made it out so far?
Well, Maleen, it's been a very tightly controlled start for the reopening of Rafah crossing. We do understand that 50 patients must be supposed today to leave Gaza in order to receive life-saving medical care out of the territory. But today, the figures that we have really found out reflects a huge shock among local civilians and even among the medical sector, where only 5 medical patients have been allowed to leave Gaza today under the supervision of the WHO. They were gathered earlier this morning in the hospital that is run by the Palestinian Red Crescent Society in the city of Khan Yunis, and they have moved to Rafah crossing in order to be later receiving life-saving medical care there. But the process itself has been very controversial and difficult. Names must be first pre-cleared, movements have been numerically capped, and the decision does not finally rest with Palestinians but also with the Israeli security vetting, which gives a sense that the whole process of evacuating patients from Gaza remains very complex and it first subjected to military clearance. So in other words, Israel is still controlling who must receive treatment first and who must left stranded in Gaza's hospitals that have been quite overwhelmed with severe shortages.
And Tarek, for those who are approved to leave through Rafah, it must, of course, be an enormous relief, not only for them, but for their families. But at the same time, there are still so many others waiting, still hoping, whose names haven't come through. How emotionally difficult and frustrating is this uncertainty for Palestinians, especially those who are left behind?
Well, for those being approved, there is some relief, yes, but it's been mixed with guilt and fear for leaving behind family, siblings, and even relatives with no clear timeline for reunion again. And let me just show you behind me there are still lots of families here on the ground are still waiting to be reunited with their loved ones who are willing to return back to Gaza today. And for those who are still left behind with given no clear timeline to leave the strip to receive life-changing treatment, they are still feeling huge and growing frustration and also disappointment because they have been struggling to receive much needed medical care in Gaza's hospitals, and Gaza's health ministry is still putting out different powerful statements regarding the numbers of people who are in desperate need to receive medical treatment outside the territory, where initial expectations suggest that 20,000 Palestinians are in urgent need to receive urgent medical evacuation to receive treatment abroad, out of 171,000 Palestinians being wounded since the onset of this genocidal war on the territory. All of this is unfolding, in fact, Maleen, while people on the ground are still subjected to Israeli attacks and different restrictive procedures regarding their departure from the territory.
Thank you so much for that. Tarek Abu Azoum there for us in Khan Yunis. I want to bring in our guests now. In Cairo, we have Hussein Haridy, a former Egyptian assistant foreign minister. In Doha, we have Mosab Nasser, president and CEO of FAJR Global, a humanitarian organization that provides medical care, surgical missions and emergency evacuations. And in Tel Aviv, we have Akiva Elder, a political analyst and a contributor to the Haaretz newspaper. A very warm welcome to all of you. Mosab, if I could start with you, because you are dealing with medical evacuations. You're on the front line. So we are hearing 20,000 people in Gaza in need of urgent medical care, many with life-threatening injuries, thousands with cancer. A few dozen evacuations a day, that's not really going to cut it, is it?
Thank you, Maleen, for having me. Absolutely not. You're talking about 20,000 people with critical injuries between blast injuries, in addition to cancer patients, in addition to so many patients in Gaza with chronic diseases that haven't been able to be treated throughout, during the past 2 years. All of them are waiting for this moment to be evacuated for treatment because the local healthcare infrastructure in Gaza is completely destroyed. And so evacuating 50 or 100 or even 200, 300 or 500 a day is not going to cut it, because we're talking about a huge number of people with injuries in addition to cancer patients. If you add all those in Gaza with chronic diseases, you're talking about thousands and thousands, especially those also that have been waiting for elective type of surgeries that have not been treated. So the answer is no.
Mosab, who is most at risk under these timelines? Is it the trauma patients, or is it the cancer sufferers, or is it the children? How quickly do conditions deteriorate once treatments are delayed?
Well, I can tell you we're dealing with two kinds of patients currently. One, the first type are the patients with blast injuries, war injuries, those with broken bones, broken skulls, those who have burns. In fact, as we speak, we're evacuating a child out of Gaza that has been completely burned from head to toe. Those kinds of patients cannot wait in Gaza. In fact, some of them cannot wait weeks for them to wait months or even years. We're talking about 20,000 patients. The second category of patients are the cancer patients that are literally dying on a daily basis in Gaza because they don't have their treatment, they cannot be evacuated. And I'm really surprised that we don't have a system in place until today to evacuate these patients to safety for them to be treated.
So just to be clear, Mosab,
yes.
What you are saying is it's not that this process is just slow. This is actually costing lives.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, every moment children die in Gaza, literally every moment. And if you don't evacuate them to safety as soon as possible, and even those who are evacuated, sometimes it's already too late for them because they are infected, and many of them actually could die as soon as they get to the finish line, effectively. So it's a very sad story to tell, especially the children, that many of them have actually lost their parents. And I can tell you a quick story of a patient that we have evacuated. She's lost the entire family. We had to evacuate her with the grandmother to the U.S. And lately we discovered even the grandmother got cancer. So it's a compounded challenge day after day.
Akiva, so you've been listening in there to Mosab. At the current pace, it could take close to a year for even half of some of these people who desperately need help to get treatment abroad. Does Israel accept that some people will die before they're reached?
Well, you have to be deaf and blind not to see what's happening. Actually, we have a problem because the Israeli government doesn't allow Israeli reporters as well as the international media to enter Gaza and interview people. But I want to follow up on the issue of treating people with human and with dignity, people who suffer from diseases. And I happen to be one of more than 1,000 Israeli volunteers who drive sick Palestinian children from the West Bank, from the occupied territories, to hospitals in Israel. And I see the crossing, the Rafah crossing, as something like lip service that Israel is paying. Israel could open up the crossing of Gaza into Israel, the crossings that were open until the war. And among those volunteers were people who were butchered in October 23. So, yes, Israel is aware of it. But the question is whether there is public support in changing the reality in Gaza, in opening up to the Palestinian population. And it's not only in Gaza, it's also in the West Bank. And I'm afraid that the Israeli public opinion, left, center, and right, are now focusing on Iran, focusing on what's going to happen in the election, in the coming election, that since 26 is an election year, and the campaign that started. And there is a battle already on the narrative. And the narrative that the majority of the Israeli public has accepted is that we are the victims. And the Hamas has to be more accountable for those images that we see of people dying in Gaza.
Okay, Akiva, I do want to come back and talk about Hamas in more detail a bit later on in the programme when we talk about stage 2 of the ceasefire. But Ambassador Haridy, if I could come to you, Egypt has called the opening of Rafah a step forward, but one that remains dependent on Israeli decisions. From Cairo's perspective, how fragile is the opening of the Rafah crossing?
Well, it's quite the ceasefire. The whole ceasefire is a shaky ceasefire, as a matter of fact, in light of the continuing Israeli bombardment and targeting Palestinians, not only in Gaza Strip but also in the West Bank. So, but having said that, we see in the reopening of the Rafah crossing, after almost 1.5 years of being closed by the Israelis, that it's a step forward. We hope to capitalize on it and start carrying out the second phase of Mr. Trump's comprehensive peace plan in Gaza and Security Council Resolution 2803 that was passed last November. So this is an opening, not only reopening of the Rafah crossing, but we hope that it would be an opening and overture for further improvement in carrying out the second phase of the peace plan. That's how Egypt views it, and we are insisting in our contacts with the American administration and with the Israeli government that it's an absolute must to work and implement this second phase. At the end of which there will be an agreed upon timetable for the withdrawal of Israeli forces.
Let me ask you, Ambassador, if I could interrupt. The opening of Rafah is meant to coincide, as we've been discussing, with phase 2 of the ceasefire. That specifically includes Hamas's disarmament and a timetable for Israeli withdrawal. From Egypt's perspective, how realistic are either of those two goals right now?
Well, we are still waiting. For the announcement of the composition of the International Stabilization Force. The commanding officer of this force has been appointed, but we are still waiting for this force to be established, because it will be incumbent on this force to supervise what's called the disarmament of Hamas. But let me remind the viewers that in the Trump's peace plan, it's not only disarming. There was talk of incapacitating the weapons with Hamas elements. But it should not be disarming.
And in terms of that, whose job is it to do that? Who's going to do that job?
Well, according to the Security Council Resolution 2803, it's the International Stabilization Force in coordination with the both Egypt and Qatar and the United States as mediators in the war. So, but this between brackets, disarming of Hamas should not be, because Hamas today, from a military point of view, is not Hamas before October 7th, 2023. So making a fuss of weapons at the hands of the Hamas people, and that would pose a future threat for the security of Israel, is not an argument that we should take seriously. And accordingly, in consequence, the disarming of Hamas should not be a stumbling block in carrying out the second phase of the Mr. Trump's peace plan.
Right. Okay. So Akiva, if I could turn to Akiva there, what do you make of what we're hearing there from Ambassador Haridy? Because if I understand correctly, inside Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu faces enormous pressure for opening Rafah without dismantling Hamas. So doesn't opening the Rafah crossing, isn't that politically unstable?
Well, I'm afraid that the Rafah crossing will turn out to be the greatest double crossing. Actually, what Netanyahu wants is to buy time. And this is kind of a symbolic gesture that he did not to the Palestinian or to Qatar. It was to President Trump. Actually, his arms were twisted very strongly, and actually, elections, as I said before, we started the countdown. It will be either in June or at the end of 26 in October. And Netanyahu will convince the Israeli public, because he's a magician in marketing his narrative, that it is just, few hundred people, it's humanitarian issue. Actually, both sides, Egypt as well as Israel, have no interest in accepting more Palestinian. Israel wants to reduce the number of Palestinians, and we see that still Israel controls about 50% of the area. So this is not a game changer, the opening of the crossing. We have to wait, as my predecessor just said. We have to see what happens in the next step, because Netanyahu will have to answer the Israeli public. What about the total victory? Now, he doesn't want to make a clear statement that the war has ended, because if the war has ended and you can declare victory, why don't you pull out of Gaza and turn back to the negotiating table on what President Trump was suggesting, to go back to a two-state solution?
Mosab, if I can come back to you, are these conversations about what comes next for Gaza all a bit mute? Because we are still not seeing aid, we're not seeing reconstruction materials, they're all still largely blocked off. How can Gaza recover medically, economically, psychologically, without even any rebuilding beginning?
I think the answer to this question is very simple. It cannot recover. You need to open all the border crossings to allow aid in, whether it's humanitarian or medical aid. I mean, I can tell you, Maleen, for now, the aid that we've been seeing going into Gaza is primarily food, which we're grateful for. We're really happy that it's going in. People are no longer kind of starving like the way we've seen, in the past. But currently, there is absolutely no medical aid going into Gaza. Even the basic medical supplies required to treat these patients does not exist in Gaza. And that's why we resort to evacuations. Again, we don't do evacuations because of the sake of evacuation. In fact, we prefer to treat all of these patients inside Gaza. But there is no healthcare infrastructure. Many of the hospitals have been destroyed. There are no medical supplies inside Gaza. I would say the basic medical supplies and medications are inside, which are not sufficient to treat even a fraction of the 20,000 patients on the list for evacuation. So the answer to this question is there's no way that you can rebuild the infrastructure, whether it's a humanitarian, medical, or otherwise, without opening the border crossings. We can debate the political questions day in and day out, but remember, people are dying in Gaza as we speak.
Ambassador, how do you respond to that?
Well, before answering your question, Madam, allow me just to comment on a remark by your guest from Israel, that Israel and Egypt don't want to see Palestinians go out of Gaza. Of course, I'm not going to speak about Israel, but I'm going to speak about my country. When we welcomed and when we worked, as a matter of fact, for the reopening of the Rafah crossing, we wanted freedom for the Palestinians in Gaza, freedom to leave the strip and the freedom to go into without any obstructions from the Israelis, whatever the reasons that the Israeli government usually gives to such an obstruction. So we have welcomed the opening of the Rafah crossing because at long last we see freedom of movement for the Palestinians. But to answer your question,
I have to interject there, though. There clearly isn't any freedom of movement. We heard there from our correspondent, only 5 people have been allowed out today, and these were people who critically needed help.
Well, I have no objections to that. I agree with it. But this is the beginning of the freedom of movement. We will be working with the American administration and with our Qatari friends and the Turks in order to speed up, first of all, the entry of human assistance, human aid, particularly medical supplies, and secondly, to increase the numbers of people leaving Gaza in order to receive the necessary medical treatment. So it's a very complicated situation. Egypt does not have the complete control on events, how events would develop in Gaza. But we are, as I said, and I insist on this point, this whole thing and this Rafah crossing has been reopened today in the context of Mr. Trump's peace plan. So we guess the American administration and President Trump himself is personally responsible for the complete implementation of his peace plan. And I'm not going to go over all the elements and the details of the second phase, but as far as human aid and humanitarian assistance is concerned, according to the plan, we have to stick to what has been agreed upon in the January ceasefire, January 2025 agreement. That is to say, not less than 600 trucks should enter Gaza every day. We are working on that. We are working on that, and we hope we'll succeed in the very short term.
Okay, Ambassador, we are running out of time. Mosab, if I could give you the final thought in one sentence, what single step do you think would save the most lives in Gaza right now?
I would say the critical thing is to bring medical aid in, medical supplies, medications. People are dying, even people, not just people with blast injuries and cancer patients, but even, people with chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, so on. Those people are dying also on a daily basis. So just remember that the people we evacuate are the people that cannot wait, like the ones with the severe and critical injuries, as well as cancer patients. But there are so many people, grandmothers, grandfathers, mothers, who actually have all kinds of illnesses, that don't have the medications that they need. So I think instead of focusing too much on evacuations, I would rather focus on opening the borders to allow for aid, to allow for medications, for medical supplies, to rebuild the infrastructure as soon as possible. And not to forget the schools. I mean, we talk about medications and patients, but you have over 700,000 Palestinian students in Gaza roaming the streets at this point without schools. That's another topic, but it's a compounded, challenging problem that needs, so many solutions.
Thank you so much to all our guests today, Hussein, Haridy, Mosab Nasser and Akiva Elder. Thank you to you two for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From me, Maleen, Saeed, and the entire team here. Bye for now.